Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. 2 weeks ago, as we wrapped our previous episode on China, it seemed events were moving yet again in the Middle East, but this time in Gaza. Well, after 2 years of horror in Gaza as in Israel, the seemingly unbelievable did indeed happen. A ceasefire was declared. Israel withdrew its forces to an agreed line. All 20 living Israeli hostages were released and some 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. However, some 19 Israeli dead are yet to be returned, dead hostages, and many Palestinians remain detained in Israel. Moreover, the plans for the day after, as it's called, remain extremely unclear. In a split-screen reality in which President Trump brokered this agreement whilst also undermining global trade, the international order, and US democracy, it is unknown what he really wants to see happen in Gaza and how much effort he'll put into implementing it. Nor is it clear who else would invest the effort. To discuss these and so many other issues, we have with us Dr. Tahani Mustafa, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Dr. Miriam Rosman of the Dvorah Forum. Hi, ladies. It's really, really, really nice to see you both with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Hi.
Well, as ever, let's start out with what we always do, which is you introducing yourselves. Tahani.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm currently a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in their Middle East and North Africa department. I was before that the senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group, and before that I've worked in various different capacities. And so I've effectively worked on Israel-Palestine for the last 15 years now, and largely been based in the region for the last 10 years.
Okay. And you also have a PhD from SOAS, don't you?
I do, yes. I hold a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, where I worked on the issue of security governance between the two occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza.
Excellent. Miriam, tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, I have a PhD from the Sorbonne University in History and International Relations. Particularly, I'm dealing with Israel-Europe relations and more particularly Israel-French relations. I wrote a book on Israel-French relations, which was published in France in 2009 and in Hebrew in 2014. I'm a member of Forum Dvorah, which is very interesting what you said, because Forum Dvorah, in a very short way, I will say, is trying to push women forwards on most of the women in Forum Dvorah are dealing either with military security issues or international relations issues. Forum Dvorah is trying to put them on more on TV, TV programs, television is in Israel and abroad, trying to bring them more around the tables of government and other places in Israel in order to see more women in powerful places. I was living 15 years abroad. I was living 10 years in Paris and 5 years in London. I always worked in Hasbara, information like relations in the Israeli embassy in Paris. I'm teaching. I used to teach and I'm still giving lectures in Affordable.
Excellent. Let's start from where it's so difficult for all of us, which is emotion, and then move on to other things. What did you both feel when you heard there was a ceasefire and the fact that to a certain extent the fighting really has stopped? Honey?
I mean, I think it was honestly nothing, unfortunately, I have to say. And I think that sentiment was shared by some of my other sort of Palestinian counterparts. It's, for us, the fighting hasn't stopped. We've seen Israel commit now quite a few violations of what had been agreed upon, including, the continued killing of Palestinians, the preventing them from returning back to their homes, the closing of Rafah, cutting aid by half as to what had been agreed upon. And I think that had been really, I think many of us had expected that. There were a lot of issues left that were quite ambiguous, that hadn't been properly ironed out. There should have been a lot of skepticism, I think, around the intentions of those involved in drafting this ceasefire agreement. For Trump, he really treated this like a vanity project. It was an incredibly well thought out PR stunt, I think, for Israel to demonstrate that it has the capacity to act in good faith, and then effectively seeing regional states strong arm Hamas into what effectively read as a capitulation agreement as it stands. And so even in the immediate, never mind the longer term, in the immediate term, just the issues of withdrawal and hostage handover have been quite complex in terms of their implementation on the ground, especially when you have two sides that completely distrust each other. And you're already starting to see that fall apart at the seams. And then just in the longer term, these more substantive issues that have also been sticking points in the past as to who's going to govern Gaza and Hamas's disarmament. And these are things that are still being ironed out at present.
How was it for you, Miriam?
I have to say that, first of all, sometimes I have a feeling people forget what happened on the 7th of October 2023. And I hear, and because I'm media, international media, I think people have to remember what happened here on October 7th. It was a massacre. 102,000 people were burned, killed, massacred in their homes. 250 were kidnapped. And for 2 years, my country is living in a trauma. It's not only the hostages' families. We are a country in a trauma. And I have to say that for the first time myself, but not only myself, on Thursday morning last week, I smiled for the first time for real, from my heart. I started to breathe. I breathe. We couldn't breathe here. And we all have seen the videos, how our hostages were treated, how they were starved, and so on. There is suffer on both sides, but I have a feeling that people are forgetting why we are here. So for the first time, my country, everybody here on Thursday morning was smiling. Families of hostages, and everybody here, we were kind of so happy that hostages are coming back, that there is a ceasefire, that soldiers are going to come back home. We lost 916 soldiers in 2 years of war that are dead, and there are thousands which are wounded for life, either mentally or physically. Society here is very, very, very. Now we are happy but we are very sad and very traumatic. It's a traumatic period that we have passed here. So obviously the euphoria, I can tell you, I was on Sunday before the hostages came back on the hostages square. I went for a French media interview, and it was amazing seeing all the Israeli people coming there with kids, families. It was it's a happiness that you can't really explain it. And on Monday, I was crying. I was seeing them coming back, seeing fathers holding their children after 2 years. They were the daughters of Omri Miran. They were kissing a photo for 2 years, saying goodnight to a photo. And for the first night, they say goodnight to their father. So it's very emotional. Monday, it was very happy here. Lech mipo. It was very happy and very sad at the same time. And obviously, on Monday during the day, when we started to hear that we are not going to have the hostages which are not anymore alive, and we started to see breaches on the contract that were on the agreement, basically, we were very happy from one side, but very sad from the other side. And you can see it here every day that we're receiving the dead bodies, and they're saying who it is, like in Bal Haiman, the last woman, which was released today, which was actually identified today. It's very complex. It's a very complex situation. From one side, we're very happy there is ceasefire. We have all the hostages alive at home, but we still have 19 hostages which are not here. And as you said, Tai, you're right. We are not trusting one another, and we don't have trust. And when they say they can't find them, we know they can find, maybe not all of them, but there are certain. Our army and special security services know part of the bodies where they are. So it's very complex. And even President Trump, he said that they cannot find them, and he wants to move on to the second phase. But you cannot go to the second phase before you finish this one. And this one is including having all the hostages back.
I'm hearing here a split screen, which I think is the very core, let's move away from emotion to, harsh reality. There is nothing in common with what the two of you are saying, holistically. You're saying that, if I understand you correctly, Tahani, that ceasefire, no ceasefire, there's no difference. You're saying, Miriam, that even if there is a ceasefire until we get all the hostages, then there's no difference. Where do we go from here? Tahani.
Well, no, I'm not saying if there's a ceasefire or no ceasefire, there's no difference. What I'm saying is that this is not a ceasefire. What we're seeing is not a ceasefire. The killing hasn't stopped. It's interesting when Miriam describes the return of hostages, which is honestly, it's wonderful to see their safe return, genuinely. But unfortunately, we haven't seen similar images on the Palestinian side. Although this deal has allowed for the release of 2,000 Palestinian prisoners in total, many of those women and children, might I add. Again, there's been no mention of the conditions of their captivities. The fact that many of these have been detained without charge or trial. The fact that many of these have endured such horrendous torture that you could actually see it when they came back. If we want to talk about the state of hostages being returned, Palestinian hostages, which is effectively what they amount to in this case, have literally been returned bruised, battered, and emaciated. In one day, 14 of the 80 that had been released had to seek a serious medical attention in Ramallah hospital. In the context of the sort of welcome that they got, Israel in the January ceasefire ensured that Palestinians were not allowed to be welcomed by their own families, and if they tried to celebrate, were either disrupted or fined.
It's in the West Bank.
Those that had been returned, yes. In the context of this recent ceasefire round, where we have seen those that have been released, those that have been sent back to Gaza, where they've had literally very little to welcome them. They have no homes left. In some cases, many of them have no family left. They've come back to effectively mourning family members. In some instances, we've seen prisoners that have been released this time who come from the West Bank, have absolutely no connection to Gaza in terms of family ties, that have been exiled into Gaza. So moving from one prison to what is, in effect, by all definitions, according to international organizations and intergovernmental organizations, an open-air prison. Never mind the fact that some of those that have been released have also been completely exiled outside of the occupied territories into places like Egypt and other regional states. And then let's not forget the fact that Israel is still holding 12,000 other Palestinians that have been detained, again, without charge or trial. And then if we want to talk about what's actually been unfolding in the last few days on the ground, by no definition meets the sort of benchmarks of what a ceasefire is and should constitute. And then in the context of the West Bank, where we're continuing to see Israel's onslaught, where we've seen the collective punishment since the 7th of October of 3.2 million Palestinians that had nothing to do with the events of the 7th of October. And that's just if we're talking about 7th of October. If we want to talk about what really led to this, then I think, again, it's a very misleading context to say that it really just started with the 7th of October, when even before that, by 2022, 64.3% of Gaza's population were living under food insecurity, where Gaza was literally an open-air prison by all definitions, where Israel has controlled the land, air, and sea space and has weaponized that time and time again when it has wanted to do that, in both territories. And even now, I think even in the in this recent ceasefire agreement, there's so much ambiguity that it really doesn't offer much of a silver lining or even a political horizon. And where Israel is able to dictate alongside its Western allies in any sort of future or interim thinking as to who can and cannot represent Palestinians. Currently, right now in Israel, we have a government that doesn't meet a single condition set out by the quartet that has been justified to isolate Hamas and groups like Hamas. And yet, the Western policy has been to continue a policy of engagement with Israel, where we haven't seen a single modicum element of pressure, even now where we've seen Israel rescind and effectively disproportionately punish, an entire population for what really amounted to was a mistake in terms of being able to hand over those bodies of those hostages that had been killed and their remains. Now, let's not, if we really want to draw parallels here in terms of those dead Palestinians that had been returned, where their legs and hands had been remained cuffed, where they were blindfolded, where there are track marks on their bodies, where they've been run over tanks, where there are gunshot wounds, where they haven't even been named. They've been left as numbers and handed over. But even in this context where Hamas made that mistake, and where Hamas themselves says 72 hours is not going to be enough to be able to allocate those hostages, and where in the past where we have seen them make a mistake, they have rectified that. They have done that. And there's really nothing to really indicate that they're not going to do that again this time round. But yet that mistake has now cost an entire population aid, really the only entry point that could allow for that aid, as well as the fact that Netanyahu is now going to use this as an eventual pretext to continue back to open warfare, which Israeli politicians, by the way, have been claiming that they're going to return to. Even Netanyahu himself said it at the Knesset with the announcement of the ceasefire, that they are going to return back to open warfare, which honestly is quite contradictory given that Israel is claiming total victory, but yet somehow needs to return back to open warfare. So the question is exactly who are they launching open warfare against if you have actually, in fact, met your objectives here, which was to destroy Hamas?
Miriam, that's a long list of, I don't know if you want to call it accusations or understanding from the Palestinian side. How do you take that and what do you feel about it? Because again, we're here to try and understand each other and see if there's any place at all in which we meet.
Okay, I'll go back forward. I'll go first as an historian and then I'll go for what's happening now. I just want to remind one important fact. In 2005, Israel withdrew from all Gaza. We took out our people from their home, from the synagogues. We left everything for them in order to build a new life, prosper life, and a good life. Israel withdrew with no condition, with nothing. That was a decision of Ariel Sharon, and that was something that is a stone in the Israeli society, and it was very difficult here. We all remember the images of people taking out from their homes, synagogues, and so on. What happened in the Gaza Strip since then? Hamas took over from the Palestinian Authority, and instead of making it a prosperous place, they built tunnels, they militarized, they made war against Israel, sent rockets over us every time, and so on. So this is my first point on saying before October 7. Now, I have to remind also something. On October 7, 22 kibbutzim, moshavim, and cities of Israel were invaded by Hamas terrorists, civilians, kids, babies, women, elderly, Holocaust survivors, in their houses. They were murdered, burned alive in their homes. And I have to say more than that. On big part of these people were people who used to go to Gaza to take the people from there to hospitals and to medical treatment in Israel, which used to help them agriculture, which received them to work in the kibbutzim and moshavim. So this is something that it's a fact that has to be known. They just went and slaughtered people on their houses, on a music festival, lots of young people who just wanted to go dancing. And it's not only that, they were making videos from the phones of the victims and from their own phones on live time, showing what's going on and what they're doing. And we have horrific videos of the kidnapping, of the slaughtering, and so on. So this has to be said. It happened. It's not something. Lots of people think that it didn't existed. It didn't happen. Israel is inventing it, and so on. So it's not our videos. It's the terrorists themselves documenting themselves. And more than that, when some of them came to be prisoners in Israeli jails, you had their saying exactly what they were told to do. There was rules and they had points what they should do when they go into the houses and the kibbutzim, moshavim, and so on. So we have to remember that as well. Now, we have to remember also that all the hostages who went into the Gaza Strip alive, and also some 42, or if I remember the correct number, were murdered already in Gaza. They have been taken alive from Israel, and they were murdered in Gaza in different circumstances by their terrorists. And more than that, none of them, for 2 years, the one that entered now, none of them was supplying, not with medicines, not with medical aid. Red Cross never could go and see them, whether their condition, with no food, and so on. And to what you said, Tahani, regarding the condition of the Israeli prisoners, the prisoners in Israel, they getting food, they can study in universities, they get everything basically. They are never tortured, and they actually go back. And Yahya Sinwar is the example for that. Someone his life was saved by Israeli doctors in the hospital. He was going to die. We saved his life. We gave him food and everything in the jail. And the minute he went back to Gaza, on Gilad actually agreement. What did he do? What did he do? Went back to terrorism and planned 7th of October. So I'm very sad for the civilians in Gaza, and obviously it's a tragedy on both sides. But I will say something, because I've been there with my own eyes. After the October 7, I went with a delegation of the foreign ministry to the south. I've been to Kfar Aza. I've been to Nahal Oz. I've been to the Nova Festival site. I've been to Sderot. I've been to the houses which were still had the remains of what happened there. And I heard the speaker of the army and of the police. They explained, yes, there were terrorists who came in on the 7th of October. That was the first part. But after them came lots of Gaza civilians, which themselves also burned, kidnapped, raped, and so on. So yes, there are innocent. I want to believe that there are innocent civilians in Gaza as well. But when I see these people who came, also the civilians, into our kibbutz and moshavim and what they did, and when I see sometimes videos of mothers in Gaza saying that they would like them kids to be shaheed, I think the most important thing is education. I think that we have to have kind of a change of education, because when I see on the other side small kids of 2 or 3 years with the uniforms of Hamas, and their wish is to be a shaheed, I think it's a dead end. So one of the things I have to remind that was on the French Saudi program and also on Trump program is a reform on the Palestinian Authority. One of them is education. And for me, the key for everything is education, because if you educate your kids for peace, if you educate your kids that the person next to you, in front of you, is your neighbor, is going to be your friend and not your enemy from both sides, we won't be here today. And I think it will take a generation or two to change all this, but if there is a willing for that. And for the moment, as I said before, my country is not yet out of this trauma. We cannot go on further on without closing this chapter. You have to understand, you have parents and families. All that they want is to bury in a dignified way their child or member of family, and to have a place to go to mourn. They can't close this circle, and we as a country, as a population, we cannot do that. And what sometimes annoys me, that people either forget what happened on 7 October, or say it's a lie, it didn't existed, or start to explain what happened before the 7th of October and to explain why they did it. Why us as Israeli, since the country of Israel was born in 1948, we have wars one after the other. We never raped women on the other side. We never slaughtered. We never, on the contrary, every time we want to do something, either our army speaker is going to say, in some time you're going to have such and such operation, please go away, not to be hurt if you're a civilian. We always give, I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because each side is saying it on another way. And it's not from today. Obviously, it didn't start today. And I want to say one more point, a very important point.
Miriam, a very short point.
A short one, but it's an historical and important one, because everybody forgets. From 1948, after the independence war, till 1967, Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria was under Jordanian rule, and Gaza was under Egyptian rule. And in this time, we didn't hear anything, not about the Palestinians, not about the Palestinian state, and nothing about that. All this started in 1967 after the 6-day war. Then you started to hear about the Arafat, the Palestinians, and so on. It didn't exist. And also, the last historical point, in 1947, in the United Nations, on the resolution of 29 November 1947, there was a resolution of 2 states, Arab states and Jewish states. The Jewish said yes, the Arab said no, and immediately after the creation of Israel, they started a war with Israel. So if we want to debate, yes, but let's remember history and the facts.
We could go back and forth on all of this, but what I'm hearing is exactly what has enabled the wars over the past 70 years and what has enabled the horrendous situation of the Palestinians and the appallingly sad situation of Israelis. What would it take for either of you to think differently, Tahani.
Well, look, this isn't about thinking differently, right? And I think there's a lot of fallacies in Miriam's recounting of history here. And I think that might be precisely part of the issue, is that if we really want to grapple with the more substantive elements of this conflict, the first is that Israel really needs to stop being in denial with its own history. Miriam, you pointed to a lot of different elements here. Firstly, the fact that you have accused or claimed that all hostages were killed by the Palestinians, when in fact you even have on camera Israeli soldiers killing during what should have been a rescue mission, Israeli hostages that were holding up white flags. The fact that you literally have Israeli soldiers just in the last 2 years alone, never mind what we've had documented and from Israeli archives themselves, Israeli war crimes, what effectively amount to war crimes, where Israeli soldiers themselves videoed sodomizing a Palestinian prisoner, where you've had numerous international human rights organizations, as well as the UN itself, document torture within Israeli prisons well before the 7th of October. Israel's 2005 withdrawal, the sad images of Israelis that were displaced, but yet then compensated with land that had again been taken from Palestinians in the West Bank to accommodate those that had been withdrawn in 2005. And then never mind the fact that Israel still retained full control over Gaza's land, air, and sea space, to the extent where Israel itself could admit that it was putting Gaza on a diet where it could calorie count, where it had literally every single member of Gaza's population on its register, where Israel was able to determine what went in and out of the strip and weaponize those border crossings when it wanted to, including Rafah, by the way, which it jointly controlled with the Egyptians. Why we had those tunnels was precisely because Israel at one point wouldn't even allow things like wedding dresses, wouldn't allow things like musical instruments, wouldn't allow things like soap and hair conditioner, for instance. That was the level of arbitrary control that Israel had in terms of what went in and out of Gaza. If we want to talk about history, we can talk about the fact that Hamas has tried to negotiate with Israel for the last 15 years before 2023. The fact that Israel, similar to what we've seen now during these negotiation processes, have effectively killed off every moderate within Hamas, has effectively killed its negotiating team, similar to what we saw in 2012, where Israel and Hamas had actually come very close to a cessation of hostilities, and where Israel decided to torpedo that process by killing Hamas's key negotiator, Ahmed Jabri, back in 2012, when he was in his car with those very papers. So, there's a whole host of things we can go back, and we can do this both sidism. This ultimately isn't about what we think. This is about the actual realities on the ground. You want to talk about education. The PA has already committed and actually done the 2 of the 3 reforms, reforming education in those textbooks and preventing or stopping payments to martyrs' families. The only thing it hasn't now done is the democratic reforms it's meant to do. But it has actually done the other 2, and they've submitted 3 reports, including having Saudi Arabia themselves submit reports indicating or providing the circumstantial evidence to prove that they have done just that to the State Department. But if we want to talk about education, this has nothing to do with the education system. And I honestly have never heard a Palestinian child that willingly, for no reason, wants to become a shaheed. Palestinians want to live. When they turn to armed resistance, when they look to things like becoming a shaheed, it's because they feel like there are no other alternatives, where they feel like they've been completely strangled in the occupied territories. Just being there before the 7th of October, I was based there in 2023. I was based in the West Bank. I wasn't in Gaza. But even in the West Bank, I can tell you, as someone who had the privilege to leave any time, I felt strangled when I lived there in terms of the lack of, in terms of the restrictions of movement, the brutality of Israeli soldiers at every checkpoint, at every border crossing. Even I, with a British passport, just having an Arab-sounding name leaves me open to detention every time I want to go in for 6 hours at a time. And I've been going in for the last 10 years. When I was a student at Hebrew University, I had a student visa. I don't even want to have to go into the conditions that were put on me, by the way, that had absolutely nothing to do with the actual rules that you'll find on Israel's embassy website. I ended up having to jump through extra loops just to get my student visa. And when I did, I was still not permitted to enter certain parts of Israel if I came across a checkpoint in Hebron, for instance. I, as a Palestinian, am not allowed to go back to my father's ancestral home, which lies in 48, because I've literally, when I have tried to go there, I stopped at a checkpoint and sent back. And that's and that's just me with the privilege that I have with a British passport. Never mind.
You're still not answering the question, though. What would make it change?
No, I'm coming to that. What needs to change is the interaction that Palestinians experience when they encounter Israelis. As a Palestinian from the occupied territory, your only encounter with Israelis is really soldiers that are so incredibly violent, that have a history of harassment, that even international organizations that have ended up having to live under similar conditions have come out with a very, very different assumption and sort of political leanings once they have actually experienced the reality of what it is like to be a Palestinian in the occupied territories. That's what needs to change, is the way that Israelis really deal with Palestinians, which has not been in good faith. So this really has nothing to do with their education system and everything to do with the reality that they experience vis-a-vis Israelis. That's what needs to change.
And what needs to change, do you think, Miriam?
I have to react for 2 or 3 things because I have to react. Excuse me.
Keep it very short.
Have you seen in East Jerusalem the books, the theater play that they're doing recently? So this is not a reform on education. One thing. Second thing, the payment to the Shaheed, the salary for the Shaheed, it didn't stop. It's just a masquerade. It didn't stop. I'm sorry. And for the third thing, I can say only what people from Gaza even will say. They say when there was no war, they will prefer 1 minute. They used to work 1 minute. They prefer because when they could have worked in Israel, they could have bring food to their families. They could have lived in peacefully, and they didn't have all this. Why Gaza is distracted? Because of Hamas terrorists. Hamas terrorists don't even care. Leave Israel on us on the side. But look what they're doing to their own people. They are killing their own people. We left the vacuum in 2 days that Israel left. They already killed who they think they're in contact with Israel. They are killing their own people. They are torturing them. They are stealing their humanitarian aid. What? No, I let you speak. Let me speak. So all these kind of things, it's not I invented them. You can see them. You have proof, documents, and so on. And I'm still will say and keep saying, Israeli army is the army which is taking care. We have an army which is all which an army which will never touch anyone, no violent army. In the contrary, and you can, and when you give me all these documents and numbers and of violation, sorry, I know where they're coming from, and it's not really the truth on the ground. This is, and I have much more to say to all what you said, but Ilana wants me to go to what I'm thinking that we have to say. So education, and I'm keeping saying education, and it's not because they have nowhere to go. They're becoming shade. No way. It's not the reason. It's because they are brainwashed since they were born. Because when I'm hearing the mothers and I'm seeing mothers in Gaza even today saying that they want their kids to be shaheed, and from the other end, you have people from Gaza who are saying that they are fed up with Hamas and the way Hamas is ruling Gaza and the way they destroyed everything. So you have both ways, and you have different voices, even in Gaza and even in the West Bank. So this is thing. What I think should be, first of all, one of the things you said between the two of us, we are both have PhD. We are both living abroad, like we lived abroad. We have kind of Western mentality and all that, and still each one of us is seeing the things differently. I think, as I said before, it won't be from today to tomorrow. You cannot change this from today to tomorrow. But for me, the key is education. I'll take it more. Abu Mazen, what was his PhD about? Anti-Semitism, Holocaust didn't existed, and so on. Yes, it's history, but you cannot have a relationship based on not even different narrative, because I can debate with everyone, but I want to debate on historical facts, on things that really happened, what happened when, because otherwise we'll never get anywhere. So that's why I'm saying education, because if you educate your children from a young age to peace, to respect the other, and not to be shaheed, and not the perspective is to be shaheed and to kill Jews and to go forward and so on. So the key is education for everything. Not only, I take it to another place. For me, education is also, if you speak about anti-Semitism, if you speak about the Holocaust, you have to know what happened in order to be able to go forward. If we keep having the narratives, even between the two of us, look what each one of us is seeing the same things on a different way, because that's the way our convictions, our education, our studies, our life on the ground. I live in Israel. I'm an Israeli. I was born here. I grew up here. I remember wars here at different ages. I remember I lost people when I was 17 years old. For the first funeral I went to in my life was when someone which has 18 years old died in the Lebanon war. That's my first funeral. Is it a normal way for someone of 17 years old to live? I mean, look, you know what? Take my children. I'll give you the example of my children for the 2 years. My son is afraid from the darkness since the October 7th. Every second night, he has nightmares and he comes to sleep in my bed. My kids, and we are living in the center of the country. We are not living in the south or in the north. How many times we had sirens and alarms and we had to run in the middle of the night to the staircase, and not only from the 7th of October, even before that. There were other operations before that.
Let's just take what you're both saying. And I think it's just depressing, but also fascinating. And it's also very realistic. You are just talking entirely past each other. You, as you pointed out, Miriam, two women with PhDs, one from London, one from Paris, and you seem to be incapable at all of understanding what the other one is saying in the terms in which she's saying it. And on that basis, how can we look ahead and say there's going to be, I don't know, even calm, let alone peace? What do we need to do to change that? And I would add to that, if I may, as somebody sitting in Brussels, you have anti-Semitism, but you also have really strong anti-Islamic sentiments in Europe at this particular moment in time. It's not that, sort of everybody loves Muslims and hates Jews or something like that.
I agree.
So what, Tahani, is what are you going to do when people turn on the Muslims?
Sorry, what do you mean? What am I going to do if people...
Well, what I'm saying is right now, there's a huge problem with anti-Semitism in Europe and, sort of all kinds of things. But I think that there's also there's a lot of support for Gaza. But as soon as that disappears, you'll see that there'll be a wave of, we don't really like Muslims. What are they doing here? And, sort of marches against that. You need a homeland. You need somewhere to go. Jews need somewhere to go. Palestinians need somewhere to go. Or is it for you either or? You either have Palestinians or you have Israelis. And for you also, Miriam, do you really think that Palestinians can live next to you? Or are you basically saying, listen, I've given them a chance, but they don't want to, they can't live here?
Listen, we're not still there. Because even if I'm looking at the Trump program of the 22 points, and even if it's one day what will happen, I'm afraid. I'm not sure afterwards. Even before October, I've said it differently. If before October 7, I was more optimistic and I had more hope that we can somehow live together, when I see that they slaughtered people who helped them, they slaughtered people from the kibbutzim who went into Gaza, who took the kids from there to the beaches in Israel, who took them to the hospitals, who helped them. When I see that, I am afraid for my kids and for my life.
There's no trust. There's no trust.
No.
What about you, Tahani?
I don't know. I'm sad what I'm saying. But for the moment right now, it will take, as I said before, even a generation, or it will have to take, I think October 7th was a break point, which made us all wake up and showed us that I'll say it as in my family and others said, we have Holocaust survivors in Israel. Some of them were killed on the massacre of 7th of October. But some of them, when you hear them saying, we came to Israel after the Holocaust because we were thinking that here we'll be safe. Here we'll be protected after all what we were having to suffer in Auschwitz, in Europe, etc., during the Holocaust. And they realize, unfortunately, that even in Israel such a thing can happen. Yes, we have a part on it. My army, our intelligence, our services, Shabak, Mossad, all them, we all have to do work on what happened. What happened?
Tahani.
Look, I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that Miriam won't acknowledge the realities of the occupation here. You want to talk about radicalized Palestinians. What about radicalized Israelis? What about the fact that Burn Their Village has become a national anthem now? The images that we've been seeing posted on social media, people don't need to do that for you. The Israelis do it very well for themselves. The way that Israel is able to document its own war crimes. So, we can talk about radicalism on both sides, Miriam. The 20-point plan really speaks about de-radicalizing Palestinians, again, making seriously no mention of the realities of occupation for Palestinians that drives that kind of radicalism. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. No, we're not inherently born with it, Miriam. So I think at this point, if we're talking about, is it a take it or leave it? No, it's not a take it or leave it. It's not one way or the other. For the longest time before the 7th of October, Palestinians were actually the ones advocating more for a one-state solution, the majority wanting a one-state solution. But what they didn't want was to live as second-tier citizens, which is what you have now, where Israel is enshrined by law an ethno-state, a Jewish ethno-state. That is actually a precondition Netanyahu has actually put on Palestinians now, on the PA, to recognize Israel, not to recognize Israel, but to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And that in itself kills any concept of having an inclusive one-state reality. Now, I think at this point, it's really premature to be talking about coexistence or one state versus two state. Clearly, there's a lot of trauma on both sides. But I think, right now, what we really should be looking for are trust-building exercises here, are trust-building mechanisms. Since you're dealing with two sides with absolutely deep distrust between each other, and where it's been difficult for one side, the stronger party in this conflict, to really act with good faith, especially given that there's been absolutely no condition placed on it when we talk about any sort of ceasefire or peace process moving forward. And never mind the fact that even now, we've heard statements coming from Netanyahu that he's on some kind of messianic vision to extend the borders of Israel into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia. So this isn't just about Palestinians anymore. It's the fact that Israel has become such a destabilizing force, and where it's even very much turning on its own neighbors. I mean, states like Jordan, Jordanians that were one of the first to really sort of spearhead a peace process with Israel, are even now feeling like they were completely duped into that process, where the conversation is even changing amongst regional states that for the longest time did pursue peace deals and peace agreements with Israel, and where Israel has actually proven to now pose an existential threat to their own neighbors.
What are the trust-building exercises that you would think of?
Well, I think the first is Israel really needs to come to terms with its own history and the realities of its occupation. And statements that Miriam is making really are just completely, just so incredibly ahistorical and go completely against what Israelis, historians, and also Israeli archives themselves have documented. And so that might be a good place to start, is to actually be truthful and honest about our own histories and experiences here.
But I suspect that she would say, unfortunately, we're going to have to end in a moment. She would say, well, the same is true to you. But that isn't a trust-building exercise. A trust-building exercise has got to be something that enables both sides to do it, as opposed to saying the other side needs to do it first and then I'll do it. That's the whole point of trust. It has been maybe a dispiriting but totally fascinating conversation. And I really want to thank you both because you've both been very honest. I think that there's often an attempt to report these issues in a very kind of either biased or very optimistic way. So actually listening what two women actually think, representing not officially their societies, has really been fascinating, if, as I say, dispiriting. That's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. So thank you so much to our guests, Tahani Mustafa and Miriam Rosman. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.
Thank you.